self-interest rightly understood. And I want to start tonight by posing what I would call the problem. And the problem is, first and foremost, what do we mean when we say self-interest? And the second question that we need to discuss is it a positive or is it a negative thing for human life? One of the foremost economists to study this concept, Albert Hirschman, noted back in 1986 that, quote, self-interest is one of the most central and controversial concepts in economics, and more generally in social science and history. It is extremely versatile, if not to say ambiguous, and its meaning has been shifting a great deal. The great political theorist Harvey Mansfield noted some years later in 1995 that, quote, self-interest, like other modern doctrines, has been subjected to a process of sedimentation that has covered it in layers of mud. So it's something that has been in use for over 200 years as a prominent element in Western thinking. It's something that has been debated, and it's something whose evaluation has changed. Turning back to Hirschman, he notes the esteem in which interest-motivated behavior is held has varied dramatically, achieving at times enormous prestige as a key to a workable, peaceable, progressive social order, but also being attacked as degrading to the human spirit and dangerously disruptive and corrosive of the foundations of society. So what we want to do tonight is answer these questions by reviewing a bit of the history of the concept of self-interest. Where did it come from? What were its contours? And then evaluating, is there a way that we can resolve this dilemma of its varied evaluation, that it is both a good thing and a bad thing, depending on how one uses it or how one understands it. So the first thing we need to do is take a look at what some of the early views of self-interest were and some of the origins and how we've come to understand it today. Now, in the broadest tradition of European thought, for thousands of years, the ideas of Christianity and what is called civic republicanism, an idea that the city-state or the state itself was the progenitor of virtue. Both of these viewed pursuit of self-interest as contrary to political community and contrary to virtue. The idea that one would pursue wealth, personal interest, personal gain, the desires of the individual over and above that of the community was seen as vicious, as evil, as somehow anti-social. All of that began to change, though, as the change in modern political thought that came about in the 16th and through the 18th century. What was going on at this time was a fracturing of consensus in the European states. The Protestant Reformation and the challenges to the authority of the church, as well as that of the state, led thinkers to re-question and to open up those dialogues once again about what was, in fact, good for the people. Some of the early thinkers that pushed on this concept, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Hugo Grotius, Benedict Spinoza, all of these thinkers started asking the question, as Spinoza posed it in 1675, whether we could, quote, conceive of men not as they are, but as they would like them to be, as the earlier political thinkers had done. His emphasis here in his political writings was that we needed to take human beings as they were. A result of this is that these thinkers started to create political theories that took the religious, the theological, and the other contending traditions that had led to war, not only internationally, but even civil war in the European states of the time. And they tried to decenter those questions. They tried to take the aristocratic as well as the theological conceptions of the good life and push them to the side, to leave them aside as a basis of political association. Instead, as Spinoza said, they needed to find what human beings were really like. So Thomas Hobbes, in his treatise Leviathan, tried in the earliest chapters to lay out what kind of creature was a human being. How did those creatures function? As Grotius said in his treatise, quote, "There are several ways of living, some better than others, and everyone may choose what he pleases of all sorts. So a people may choose what form of government they please. Neither is it the right of the sovereign, which he has over his subjects, to be measured by this or that form, or of which diverse men have diverse opinions, but by the extent of the will of those who conferred it upon him." These thinkers, broadly speaking, are considered to be social contract theorists. The idea was, although they varied in particulars, although they varied in their theories of sovereignty, that each one of them saw there being a mutual interest that brought people into society, that was the basis of political association, that something similar, something unique among a social group led them, impelled them in some cases, to form political societies and to tolerate those contending interests, but to put a more civilized tone on it, to remove the things in political society that had led those other people to want to kill, compel, torture, and outright rule over other peoples. This removal of those views started to the discussion of what it was when people acted not based upon their passions, their urges, their emotions, but also not necessarily based upon their reason, based upon their reflected consideration. Instead, based upon what these thinkers began to call their interests. Typically, this meant something like their interests in monetary or commercial gain. There was a great transition into the 18th century led by the thinkers, for example, or the ones I'll use tonight, by Bernard Mandeville, Giambattista Vico, or Voltaire. The idea was that they had started to think that some of the things that had been previously condemned as being vices, self-regarding passions, self-interested character traits, the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of luxury, trade, could actually be virtuous in a roundabout kind of way. Mandeville, for example, in a famous work called The Fable of the Bees, wrote that society, if it had removed all of those passions and all of those so-called private vices, would be left without any public benefit. That in fact, it was a good thing for the society to tolerate such inaction of interest for the betterment of the whole society. As Vico noted, quote, "Out of the ferocity, the avarice, and the ambition, these three vices which lead all mankind astray, society makes national defense, commerce, politics, and thereby causes the strength, the wealth, and the wisdom of republics. Out of these three great vices," he noted, "which would certainly destroy man on earth, society thus causes civil happiness to emerge. This principle," he noted, "proves the existence of divine providence. Through its intelligent laws, the passions of men who are entirely occupied by the pursuit of their private utility are transformed into a civil order which permits men to live in human society." Likewise, Voltaire noted, "It is as impossible for a society to be formed and lasting without self-interest as it would be to produce children without carnal desire or to think of eating without appetite. It is love of self that encourages love of others. It is through our mutual needs that we are useful to the human race. That," Voltaire noted, "is the foundation of commerce, which is the eternal link between men." This idea that they had promoted in the early part of the 18th century was that there was a transformative and unexpected and unintended consequence of what was otherwise considered to be poor character traits, something that they would otherwise condemn, as Vico noted. The Brit David Hume also continued this theme when he noted, "Political writers, not just economic, but political writers, have established it as a maxim that contriving any system of government and fixing the checks and balances of the Constitution every man ought to be supposed a knave, to have no other end in his actions than private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good. Over the course of the 18th century, though, other thinkers began to soften this view of self-interest. They began to see it not as avaricious, greedy, selfish, that ironically or even unexpectedly led to the public good or to public peace, but instead they started to note that there was something actually civilizing about the commercial virtues, about the things that impelled individuals to pursue that interest, that the interest had started to emerge as being separate from both the bad, the vices, the passions, the appetites, the things that pull human beings downward toward sin and toward wickedness, as well different from what one and many of these thinkers considered to be the higher virtues. So Montesquieu, the great French thinker, noted that it is, quote, fortunate for men to be in a situation which, though their passions may prompt them to be wicked, they nevertheless have an interest in not being so. They started to emphasize, Stuart and Montesquieu and others, that commercial life could actually lead to this quelling of passions, to the better and more equitable and more progressive type of civilization that Hugo Grotius or that Hobbes or that Locke had hoped for. This insight that they had was transformed fundamentally by the major thinker Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith was, although many associate him with economics, actually a professor of moral philosophy. His two works that we know him for are The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he published in 1759, an attempt to account for what gave rise to virtuous and vicious behavior in humans. And then his much more well-known treatise, The Inquiry into the Nature and the Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It's both of these that I want to speak about tonight, but it's more particularly The Wealth of Nations, where Smith attempts to account for how self-interest works in a society. So there are really three key insights that Smith hits upon that I want to elaborate a bit about so that we can understand where our more modern concept that Smith cements of self-interest comes from. So the first of these insights is Smith notes that the human animal has a propensity to do what he called to truck, to barter, and to exchange. That is, human beings like to benefit each other through mutual trade. As he notes, quote, the division of labor from which so many advantages are derived is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Smith notes that this trading, that this exchange that takes place as a result of the division of labor is actually one of the foremost causes, as he says, of the wealth of nations, of prosperity, or as he says in that quotation, of general opulence, the enrichment of us all. That thing, that gain from trade, the willingness, for example, to give $10 in exchange for a meal, is because you value that meal more than you value that $10. And the person who provides you that meal values that $10 more than the effort and the emphasis that and the product that they put into that meal, that both of you benefit. And that is an enormous insight that trade, which earlier generations had seen as a distraction from the passions, a distraction from the religious wars, was actually a positive good, that everyone could benefit from this. That was one of his crucial insights. Of course, the other, perhaps his most famous insight, although it only appears in his writings a mere 3 times across 2 very long volumes or 3 volumes, 2 of The Wealth of Nations and 1 of The Moral Sentiments, the idea of the invisible hand. Now, this idea of an unseen force that brought together effects that were not intended by the actors was not unique to Smith. Others had thought of this idea. Others had developed this sense that there could be forces beyond what we intended. But it's really Smith who puts this into the context of self-interest. He noted that by preferring the support of domestic industry to that of foreign industry, the commercial interest intends only his own security. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So right there, before I continue on with this quotation, Smith is saying that merely by acting in our interests, by pursuing what we see as in our best interest at the moment, we can affect a greater good. We don't intend that greater good. In fact, Smith in other parts of the treatise says, when we intend that greater good, we often do worse for the community. But instead, this invisible hand can allow us to contribute to the public good, to the social welfare without our full intention. He notes, continuing, it is always for the worse for the society when it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So he essentially says that by all of us acting in our self-interest, we may actually achieve higher levels of prosperity, higher levels of social good. And then the final of the key insights that I want to note about Adam Smith is that he notes that this exists most of all in a system of what he calls perfect liberty or free competition. Smith made his name in the cause of the wealth of nations by identifying what he determined or what he called mercantilism, a system of government interventions to try to promote the interests, in this case, of England, of the king. The policies that were adopted, the same ones that led to the unrest in the colonies, the same ones that led members of those 13 colonies to see their interests as being separate from those of Great Britain. Those policies, Smith noted, did not actually enrich the British Empire. In fact, he says they tended to pervert it because when given the power of government, when given the power of compulsion, individuals see more shallowly their own interests. They don't understand the nature of the invisible hand. And so they, in a way, pervert and corrupt and attack what is truly in their interest. As he says, quote, the whole of the advantage and a disadvantage of different employments of labor and stock must, in the same neighborhood, be either perfectly equal or tending to equality. This would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, that idea of perfect liberty, where there was perfect liberty, where every man was free to both choose his occupation as he thought proper and to change it as often as he thought proper. Every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment, end quote. Now, that sounds like Smith is a great proponent of the role of self-interest, of the idea that we should pursue what is best for us and leave to the invisible hand, leave to the vagaries of our unintended consequences, what is going to serve the best for society. But there's some ambiguity in Smith. Indeed, this ambiguity has led scholars to write volume after volume debating and contending about how Smith makes sense. They even have a name. It's called the Adam Smith problem. There's a whole concept here. The ambiguity is that in the theory of moral sentiments, in this treatise where Smith attempts to explain the nature of morality and the moral systems of the world, he's not so positive about the idea of self-interest. He says that commercial society tends to produce what he calls inferior virtues: temperance, modesty, moderation, industry, frugality. It produces a kind of character in an individual that he says only merits our, quote, cold esteem. Howsoever selfish, he says, man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. When he discusses the nature of virtue, when he discusses those higher virtues, he notes that one ought feel much for others, little for ourselves, to restrain our selfish and indulge our benevolent affections. This, he says, constitutes the perfection of human nature. Now, this concept, this ambiguity, has come to be known the idea of what is called enlightened self-interest, or sometimes self-interest rightly understood, as I'll talk about in just a minute. The idea is that there is a balance that needs to be drawn between the purely commercial virtues, the purely commercial attempts at advancing the interests of oneself and thereby the interests of society, and a broader, a more benevolent, a more communal set of virtues. Though the most virtuous, those who embody the highest virtues, as Smith says, are quite rare, they are nevertheless necessary. Their influence on society is vitally important. They need, he thinks, to be an influence on the others, to raise them up from those medium or middling virtues of industry and frugality that only recognize a cold esteem. This idea of enlightened self-interest, or this idea of self-interest rightly understood, is a transition. It's important. Smith, by taking away the negative connotation, the purely negative connotation that had informed the idea of interest in earlier thinkers, smoothed it out. But he still retained a view that self-interest was only possibly a good, and only in certain situations. Alexis de Tocqueville, a thinker, a French visitor to the United States in the 1830s, who published the famous treatise, Democracy in America, had the best expression of this, I think. He noted that Americans had embodied this new idea of self-interest, that they were, in his treatise, as he said, restless in the midst of abundance, that they were constantly pursuing their own interests. But he also noted that Americans had this unique idea of self-interest rightly understood. He noted, quote, "It is not a lofty one, but it is a clear and sure one. It does not aim at mighty objects, but it attains without excessive exertion at that which it aims. The principle of self-interest rightly understood produces no great acts of self-sacrifice, but it suggests daily small acts of self-denial. By itself, it cannot suffice to make a man virtuous, but it disciplines a number of persons in habits of regularity, temperance, moderation, foresight, self-command. If it does not lead men straight to virtue by the will, it gradually draws them in that direction by their habits. If the principle of interest rightly understood were to sway the whole moral world," he noted, "extraordinary virtues would be more rare. But I think that gross depravity would then be less common." In other words, de Tocqueville is noting that Americans have achieved a kind of evenness, a sense that one can do well for oneself, but also consider the good of society, that one can almost internalize that invisible hand, that one can actually make determinations about what you wish to do, about what actually serves your interest, in a way that's concomitant to the interest of society, that both are harmonious. And Americans in the 1830s and 1840s were incredibly proud of this idea. Although they did not have extensive government interference in the economy, there were not great projects of building, of infrastructure, Americans nevertheless had noted that they had achieved enormous economic prosperity in the space of merely 50 or 60 years since their independence. They were very proud of this self-reliance that they exhibited. But that seed of doubt about the influence of self-interest on human virtue and on civilized society was met in the 19th century, and indeed earlier in the 18th century, by devastating criticism, by noting that there was a reduction of self-interest to the mean, the low, indeed the corrupting influences. And there's no better example of this type of criticism, of course, than Karl Marx. Marx, as many of you probably know, was a great critic of capitalism. He was a great visionary of the ideas that would stretch out in many permutations, in many forms, to criticize capitalism. Indeed, he recognized the incredible productivity of capitalism in an economic sense, but he criticized it for what it did to human beings. The practical application, Marx noted, of man's right to liberty is man's right to private property. The right of man to private property, therefore, is the right to enjoy one's property, to dispose of it at its own discretion, without regard to other men, independently of society. It is, he said, the right of self-interest. This he condemned. This, he said, was harmful, was corrosive. Indeed, he said, the more egoistic and asocial man becomes, the more he becomes alienated from his own nature. He becomes an abstract being, an automaton, a spiritual and physical monster. Marx thought that the elevation of self-interest to a fundamental motivation and basis for social order was deeply, deeply corrupting. Although it allowed for the productivity to throw off feudalism, to throw off older forms of society, it was precisely that corrosive aspect of self-interest that would lead ultimately to the communist revolution, to the change, to this new economic man that would be appropriating not his own self-interest, but instead would be working toward the interest of all. His co-author, Friedrich Engels, noted, naturally, it is in the interest of the trader to be on good terms with the one from whom he buys cheap, as well as the other to whom he sells dear. Such, he noted with irony, is the humanity of trade. You have brought about the fraternization of the peoples, but the fraternity is the fraternity of thieves. Marx and others criticized capitalism and criticized self-interest on that basis at the very time that other thinkers, such as John Stuart Mill and his father, James Mill, were centering self-interest as being the very basis of a modern economy. They came up with the concept of homo economus, the economic man, this rational calculator, someone who could use his mind to determine the means and ends to achieve his interests, that would harmoniously build up a society, that would produce wealth. As John Stuart Mill noted, political economy considers mankind as occupied solely in acquiring and consuming wealth, and aims at showing what is the course of action into which mankind, living in a state of society, would be impelled if that motive were the absolute ruler of their actions. But throughout these modern variations, condemnations of self-interest took many forms. Richard Salzman, in a recent article, noted that there are 7 of these that are worth considering. Some say self-interest is simply automatic. Doesn't everything someone does, isn't it what they think is in their self-interest? Doesn't everyone always pursue what's in their self-interest? No one actively acts against what they think is their own self-interest. Some say it's myopic, short-sighted, that you may do what's in your interest, but that it has long-term negative consequences. Much of modern game theory, the prisoner's dilemma, the idea that if you act in your interest, it may suit you now, but it will be in the long run harmful to your interest or to the interests of society. Others claim that it's atomistic, that self-interest is only something that one can pursue alone, that it draws one away from society because social relations are inherently non-self-interested, that you are pulled away from society. Others claim it's reduction to materialism. This is a very clearly in the Marxian quotes, the idea that self-interest reduces us from our social values to merely seeing everyone as a means to an end, monetarily, materialistically. Others say it's hedonistic. Self-interest is merely what we do to enjoy ourselves, to get short-term pleasure, to shoot up on drugs, to do crazy things, to risk our lives just for that rush, just for that hedonistic pleasure. Others say it's inherently antagonistic, that contrary to Smith's view of the invisible hand, that self-interest is somehow always in conflict, that it's fine for me to be self-interested as long as everyone else I'm dealing with is not. But if everyone else is self-interested, we're always going to be coming into conflicts. And then finally, that there's an element of sadism to it, that self-interested actors would step on anyone, would crawl over bodies, would cut, cheat, lie, steal, do whatever they could to gain their self-interest. Now, all of this had arrived at the 20th century to what Hirschman had said was this almost varied view of self-interest. Some who promoted it as the very basis of our free economy, of our system of capitalism. Others who said it was the very thing which we needed to rid ourselves of. But the thinker that I want to end on tonight, that I want to consider as a solution to this problem, actually takes a completely radical view of the idea of self-interest by, as we'll see, asking completely different questions. So that thinker is Ayn Rand. You may know Ayn Rand from her novels, from Atlas Shrugged, or from The Fountainhead, or from her novella Anthem. But it was a work in 1964 where she laid out her moral philosophy called The Virtue of Selfishness that I want to turn to as an understanding of a way that self-interest can be completely reconfigured. And as you might guess from the title of this work, Rand was an advocate, by the title itself, The Virtue of Selfishness. Rand was an advocate of self-interest, but she understood it in a completely different way. So the insights that I want to talk about, 3 key insights for Rand as well. Number 1, she reframes fundamental questions. She begins the discussion of self-interest, not at the level of economics, not at the level of politics, but at the level of ethics. She asks the question, is it fundamentally one of ethical theory? That is, should each individual be the beneficiary of their own action? That's an ethical question. That's not necessarily, it has political impact, it has economic impact, but fundamentally asking about whether or not we should act in our self-interest is a moral question. She reseats it as a moral issue. And Rand notes that although this is an important question, who should be the beneficiary of moral action, it is actually a secondary question. It's unfortunately treated as if it's the primary. For Rand, the primary question is, what are values? If self-interest is the pursuit of values for oneself, what are those values? And to begin her ethical theorizing, she completely reframes the issue. Rather than entering the field of ethics and morality by saying, what should be the virtues? What should human beings do to act morally? Rand asks the question, why do human beings need values in the first place? In other words, why do we even need morality? Why do human beings need it? She asks this because it's fundamental to understand where those values come from in order to understand how to answer that question. And she wants to know, are these values that we adhere to, are these virtues that we want to practice, and ultimately to determine who should benefit from our virtuous action, are these mere human convention? Are they things that we just agree about, that are completely arbitrary, that we vote on, or that we allow majority rule? Or is there some basis in reality? Is there some basis in the facts that give rise to why we need a moral code? The question of value, she says, presumes the question of value to whom and for what. And this is where she enters into her science of morality. Rand's answer to that question is that there is indeed a reality-based, grounded, factual basis for morality. It's not mere convention. It's not handed down from on high. It's something that each individual interacting with reality needs and must have to be successful in life. And the basis for this, she says, is that question of value to whom and for what. When one says a human being, one has to acknowledge certain facts about human beings, the most important of which is that human beings are living creatures. They face a fundamental alternative. They face the alternative of life or death. They must act to maintain, to continue their life. If not, that life ceases to exist. The choice of life or death, she says, is the fundamental orientation of our values. Human beings are self-generated, goal-seeking creatures. We have certain facts about our existence that make it such that we need to pursue values. If we don't, we go out of existence. We no longer live. In order to succeed, in order to flourish as a human being, you have to choose the right values. And so that means you must discover what is valuable to you. What determines those values? What makes a thing valuable to a human being in order for them to choose it to flourish? Reality. The facts that pertain to the type of creature, to the type of entity that human beings are. They aren't rocks, they aren't plants, they're not dogs, they're not fish, they're not any other kind of creature. They are human beings. That is the ultimate answer to where our values must come from. That which furthers our lives qua human beings as distinctively human creatures, not merely hooking me up to a feeding tube and putting me in a dark room and making sure that my body still survives, but rather survives as a human being, distinctively human being. As Rand notes, that which furthers the life of human beings is the good. That which harms it is the evil. Now that seems great, but that doesn't yet answer the question. What is the good? What furthers human life? What are the things that we have to have? Now, the facts of reality that continue about human beings that come to play here. Number one, we don't have an automatic standard of value. We don't have instincts. We don't have a preset set of values that allow us to flourish. We don't immediately get up and start walking after we're born in the way that some creatures do. We don't instinctively know how to hunt or how to root for the kinds of foods that are good for our body. We must discover that. We must figure that out. Human beings come equipped with no preset code that tells us how to survive. We must ask, by what means do human beings survive? What is their unique tool of survival? It's not speed, it's not claws, it's not wings, it's not any of the things of other creatures. Instead, it is what is distinctive about us. Our reasoning mind, our consciousness, our conceptual consciousness that allows us to interact, to see the world, to form ideas about what works and what doesn't, to take account of our lives as we act, and to bring that knowledge together so that we can understand what works and what doesn't in our lives. That tool of survival, our minds, means that what we must do to gain any values that further our lives is to engage in a process of thought. For Rand, the most fundamental virtue, the thing which gives rise to all of her other ethical system, is the idea of rationality, of choosing to engage in one's mind in a process of thought with reality to come to the answers that we need in life, that we have to assess whether any particular action is going to promote or not promote our lives, whether it is in fact a value or not, whether it is truly in our interest. Because as she notes, there is no automatic answer to that question. Nothing is given except potential and the means to exercise that potential. You cannot know automatically what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. It must be discovered. It must be figured out. Now she's able to answer that next question, the one with which we started this evening. What are the right goals to choose for survival? This is the science of ethics, and it's an enormous topic. It'd be a whole lecture in itself, and fortunately, the next lecture in this series is going to be much more focused on that question. Craig Biddle next week will be talking about how to have a flourishing life, how to choose to use your reason to flourish. I want to go back to that question though. Human life in this ethical question, pursuing values, being a thinking creature, ultimately has to ask the question, that's all true, but for whom should our action be beneficial? To whom should we make these choices? Rand's answer here of who is the proper beneficiary of moral action is, as you may have already guessed from the title, the self, the individual who takes that moral action. The individual herself should be the beneficiary of her moral action. Egoism is contained in the many ways of the science of her ethics. And it's again through her recognition of the facts about the human entity that give rise to this. Each individual person, each person who thinks and acts is an individual, necessarily both physically as well as intellectually. That action that we take, that self-initiated, self-generated, motivated action that forms the basis of all our values is inherently individual. Each individual must take action to support and sustain his or her own life. Human life requires long-range, all-embracing determinations of value. Life is essentially motion. Every act that one takes contributes to or diminishes our pursuit of a flourishing life. So the chooser, the individual, must do so in a way that is consonant with a whole life, a life of flourishing. Human beings have to develop principles of action. It's too much data to try to choose every single action, every single choice on whether or not this can be generalized to my life. Our consciousness simply can't hold that amount of data. We don't even have supercomputers that can do it. Instead, we have a unique mechanism, our conceptual consciousness, that allows us to perform an almost astounding act of condensing enormous knowledge into principles. Principles of action that are what we call virtues. Act justly, the virtue of justice, tells us enormous amounts of data about whether we should interact with people in a certain way, how to judge them, how to treat other people when they act in a community against each other, for each other, et cetera. It allows us to condense that into a virtue that if we successfully act on that and practice it consistently will lead to success in our lives. The need to be concerned with one's own interests is not merely a physical one. In fact, for Rand, more importantly, it's an intellectual one. One must be rational and use reason, and the requirements of rationality are the independent use of one's mind to evaluate, access, and to act on the facts of reality. That is why, she says, the creature that must take action to sustain its life, that must engage in a process of thought, for that individual to be told that someone else is the beneficiary of that action is like a kind of robbery. It's a kind of taking from that person. It's a making of that person as a sacrifice to others. Rand said there are no sacrifices in a rational morality, neither the individual to the group, nor the group to the individual. Everyone is a self-sustaining, independent actor. To be, as one of Rand's leading scholars put it, quote, to be for a rational being is to be selfish by an act of choice. In the social realm, the last of the three key insights, this means that Rand rejects the code of sacrifice, whether that means that you think that the group can demand from the individual, or whether that means as an individual, you can just trod heavily over the group to get what you want. You can neither take values from others nor expect others to demand values of you. It is a code of trade, a system of justice. It is a recognition, ultimately, of the fact that rational selfishness is the purview of all human beings, that the code of values that is proper to our lives is proper to all lives, and that the proper way to interact with other human beings is in accord and respect that they are choosing beings who must act in their self-interest. Rand noted that there are two profound values to be gained from society, and indeed that form the basis of society, of self-interested individuals, that of knowledge and that of trade. But that each thing, the gaining of knowledge, the wisdom of the ages, that which our elders can teach us, that which we learn in school, when I say that you must learn everything, you must determine your values on your own, it does not mean in isolation. We are social creatures. We learn these things by interacting with others, by gaining knowledge from others. But it's ultimately our responsibility to determine whether that knowledge, in fact, accords with the facts of reality, or whether it is their wishes, their hopes, their dreams, their irrationalities. We are ultimately responsible to judge whether the knowledge that is being given to us is true or not. Likewise with trade, it is our responsibility, each individual's responsibility, to do so egoistically and voluntarily, to only accept as the terms of their self-interest that others respect and are respected in kind in the pursuit of self-interest. Only by doing so can one live in a proper society that has a harmonious sense where self-interest is not seen as a tolerated vice or a mere low virtue, but the very essence of what it means to flourish as a human being, to create all of the wonderful art and music and books of history and the sporting events and all of the great industrial production. All of this comes, ultimately, Rand says, from each individual pursuing his or her self-interest in a way that is consonant with his or her values. Individual values, no doubt, in the specifics, but values that are consonant with the requirements of a flourishing human life. And so if we turn back now to those condemnations or those variations of what people think self-interest means, we can see that this reconceptualization and that this reseating of self-interest, not as merely a political contrivance or not as merely an economic contrivance, actually helps us to answer these. For one, self-interest is most certainly not automatic. Human consciousness and human thought is capable of error. It's possible that we are wrong. We can act and do so in a way that is in fact against our long-term self-interest. It is not automatic. It is not enough to say, isn't everyone selfish? Isn't it that everyone acts in a way that they wish to act and therefore it is selfish because they choose it? But doing so runs aground of the fact that making the wrong choices, living in ways that are detrimental to your health and to your cognitive health. It's not simply that you shouldn't just eat as much food as you want and ingest whatever drugs come by you and live recklessly and then ultimately perish because you've destroyed your physical body. Likewise, it's not automatic that you program your mind with the right thinking methods, that you think logically, that you think rigorously, that you only use the facts. These are accomplishments. These are the things that are virtue: to act independently, to think long range, to engage in a process of thought is not automatic. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of cases that one can think of almost at the tip of one's finger to understand the many myriad ways that individuals act against their self-interest. It's also not necessarily myopic. It can be. Individuals pursuing their interest. Does this ice cream look good tonight? Sure, I'll have a gallon. Well, that's pretty short range. If you do that every night, if you enact that as a principle of your life, you might not find that the consequences are so flourishing. You might find that that is actually bad for you. Likewise, does this feel good? Well, it might feel good in the short term. It might give you pleasure in the short term, but actually be in the long term harmful to you physically and harmful to you psychologically. There are all kinds of ways that self-interest has to be long range in order to be successful. As Rand says, life is motion, and that motion is either progressing toward a goal or away from that goal. Although each individual step may be a small one, it is nevertheless one in a direction. And so myopic is, although sometimes the way that people live their lives, certainly not necessitated by self-interest. Individuals can conceptualize and think of their long-term self-interest. And it most certainly is not atomistic. Individuals pursuing their self-interest can do just fine in society together. Indeed, the wisdom of Smith and others in the 18th century that still is true to this day is that there are gains from trade. Individuals pursuing their interest consonant, not just with an economic sense, do I get more money in the end, but in a more robust sense of egoism in Rand's view. Is it good for us? Yes, it's positive. It leads to enormous innovations in health and travel and in manufacturing and all of these areas of life. And it's not just materialistic. Individuals, even as Smith recognized, occasionally pursue what is pleasurable to them that is non-material. Self-interest most certainly does not mean mere gain on the material level. There are enormous intellectual, psychological, or dare I say spiritual goals that a rational individual sets for himself. Love, a romantic relationship, friendship. a sense of the beauty of the world, pursuit of things that are awe-inspiring. All kinds of values that individuals can pursue consonant with their self-interest are not purely materialistic. And it's certainly not hedonistic. Just like the atomistic or the myopic idea, this is something that is only a mistake of pursuit of self-interest. Although some people think that it's in their interest to do these things, in fact, hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, is going to lead you down the path of toward death, ultimately. It is not life-affirming to simply pursue what is momentarily physically pleasing. And as I said, with the materialistic and others, it's not antagonistic or even sadistic. The recognition of a rational being is that one cannot truly gain values by engaging in acts of expropriating, taking, seizing from others. That trade is how one mutually benefits. And this, I think, is that complete reorientation of the idea of self-interest that helps us both build upon those key insights that the 18th century gave us, but also to resolve by reorienting it on a moral level, the question of whether or not self-interest is a good thing. So I want to wrap up there. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to just, let's see, we'll go ahead and let me flip back to the, well, let's see. Let's get to, I thought I had a blank slide. It's in here somewhere. So as I do that, let me just get us to the questions. Okay, there we go. So there's a nice blue screen that we can look at as we deal with some questions here. And I'm going to go ahead actually and stop sharing that screen. Oh, let's see. There we go. Okay, so I see some questions. I'm going to also pull up the chat as I think there might be some questions in there. So let's see. The first question is, political speakers were supposed to be good for people. If so, why is there so much controversy with politics now? Now, that's a good question. One of the really interesting insights of a group of scholars in the 20th century, known as what is in economics and in political science, the public choice school, has noted that the pursuit of self-interest or the pursuit of what one thinks is their self-interest is not limited to the economic realm. That when individuals act politically, they can also act in ways that are detrimental, not only to society's interest, but as well to the interest of themselves, to what is in their own long-term interest. So the controversies, I think, in politics today often derive from the fact, as Adam Smith noted, that when individuals declaim that they are working for the public interest, they're often doing so in a way that is contrary and counter to their own interest and the interest of the country. And there are those who recognize that. So it is ultimately a conflict between the idea that politicians should always work in the interest of the community, which I think we can clearly see that they do not, and the fact that that's perhaps what some expect them to do. So it's a kind of tension that I see between what people expect of politicians and how politicians might actually behave. I see another question. How would you say that one can find the balance between self-interest and the interest of the rest of society? Well, I think in a sense that they are not in opposition in Rand's view, that the interest of oneself as a rational being is coterminous with the interest of society, that living in a society of other rational individuals who are pursuing their self-interest is, in the Smithian sense, it is almost as if by an invisible hand, the interest of the society. One of Rand's methodological approaches in her analysis of political society was the idea that one can learn an enormous amount about society by studying individuals. One cannot learn much about individuals by studying society in the aggregate. It's a kind of methodological individualism, an idea that there are not contrary interests when you group individuals together as members of a society that are different from or in antagonism to the interests of any given individual. If that were the case, if there were a society that had an interest, say, in something that was detrimental to one of its members, one would no longer say that that individual or that society were operating on the principle of rational self-interest. They would be operating on the idea that the interests of some aggregate of the society trumped, oversaw, or could squelch the interests of an individual, the true interest of that individual. Now, one might see examples, for example, that individuals in different times and in different choices may assess that they have an interest, for example, in, let's take a political example. I'm a producer of steel, and in the moment, without a complete assessment of the issue, I might think that it's in my interest for there to be a high tariff on foreign steel imported into the United States, because that would mean that American customers would be required to buy my steel because it would be the cheapest steel. They would, out of their own interest, they would buy the steel from me rather than from foreign competitors, because the government would step in and make the foreign competitors' steel more expensive. And that seems to be, to me, in my interest. But it's detrimental not only to the interests of society, that is, society is investing more of its effort and resources in producing the value that exchanges for my steel. In other words, the tax is a tax on the consumers of steel by paying higher prices than would otherwise be available through trade, because I think that's in my interest. So it costs society more. It's clear that that's not in the interest of the society. Everyone has to pay more. There's less flourishing. There's less material production, because some of that money that otherwise would have gone to, sporting events or music or plastics production or what have you, has now gone to steel that didn't need to go to steel to produce that same steel. But the contrary is true as well. The contrary, it's not just that I can pursue something that might be in my interest that's detrimental to society, but society can't say, oh, even though you produce steel and it costs this much, and maybe you are the lowest cost producer, we're going to require you to produce it at even, or we're going to require you to sell it at even a lower cost, lower maybe even than your marginal cost to produce. We're going to require you to sell it at a fixed price. Well, that is certainly in the interest of that society in the short-term sense that that society is getting their steel more cheaply than it would be otherwise. But it's also detrimental in many and various ways. It not only sets the precedent that the majority can force the individual, can violate the rights of the individual in order to get what they think is in their interest, but they're also setting up the precedent that you can acquire things without a regard for their cost. You can acquire things without mutual gains from trade. That ultimately breaks down. A society that attempts to price goods in the interest of society against that of certain individuals can never ultimately prosper, because some of those individuals may no longer produce those goods. Some of those individuals may walk away from those jobs. That can't persist. So the idea that there would be a conflict or there would be a need to balance the interests of society and the individual only works if the society or the individual can enact rules, laws, or engage in behavior that harms others. If you have a principle of rights protection where individuals and the society cannot engage in acts of force or compulsion against other members of that society, you only have trade. You only have mutually consensual trade to deal with. That creates that coterminate, that unity of the interests of the individual and society, such that it doesn't need to be balanced in that way. Okay, let's see. The next question is: would humans necessarily be considered bad if they did anything morally right because it makes them feel good about themselves? That's an interesting question. The idea of doing something that you feel good about yourself as the judge of the morality of an action, it depends. What makes one person feel good might, in fact, I feel good when I get a good night's sleep and I feed myself well and I go to work and I do the things that are supportive of my life. that makes me feel good. Those are also things that I think exhibit the justice or the virtues of productivity and of justice and of self-regard. However, an individual might say, what makes me feel good is taking things from stores and stealing from my friends, et cetera. That wouldn't be morally right. But let me make sure maybe the question is asking a little bit different view. Is it okay to be motivated by what makes one feel right? If that's in line with what is moral? Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the factual things about human nature that Ayn Rand notes, that many moralists have noted in the analysis of our motivation for virtuous action, is that there is, as a fact of human nature, a pleasure-pain mechanism. Things that are generally promotive of our health and of our long-term survival tend to feel good. Not all of them do. Some of them don't taste good or don't feel good in the moment. But in general, there is a consonance of what feels good, what makes us feel better about ourselves, both psychologically and physically, and what is in fact in our interest, what is in fact moral for us. But that's not always the case. We can't use that feeling of pleasure as the judge of that, because it is not a true barometer of what is in our interest. We have to, as I said, we have to use not our sensations, which are a part of human nature, but they're not the final part. That final part is our thinking mind, our ability to draw out principles of action, things that guide us in the moment, a code of values that guide our choices and actions, are what ultimately allows us to continue to prosper and have what Rand says is the result of virtuous action, which is happiness. Not happiness in the sense of momentary fleeting jubilation, although that is part of life, but happiness in the sense that Aristotle talked about. He used a concept that in the Greek is denoted as eudaimonia. Often it's translated into English as flourishing. It's something that is a kind of benevolent disposition of contentment and satisfaction with life, a kind of positivity that one gains from virtuous action. When one does what is right consistently and over time, you get that feedback. You get that sense that, yes, I am succeeding in life. And so you do choose the things that make you feel good in that broadest sense, not in the merely physical sense, because one recognizes that the cognitive, the intellectual sense of the right is ultimately what defines and conditions how we understand our morality. So I think I kind of answered it both ways. I'm not sure exactly how the question was posed, but I think that maybe covers both of those. Let's see, let's move on to our next question. If we are being self-interested, are we being selfish? Well, this is an interesting question terminologically. In today's culture, to describe someone as selfish often and almost probably exclusively has the connotation that this is a harmful, a bad, a short-sighted, all of those things that I listed, a way of looking at the world that is not in one's self-interest. That to be selfish is actually often to depart from one's self-interest. As you noted, in 1964, Rand chose very consciously that title, The Virtue of Selfishness, as opposed to the virtue of self-interest or the virtue of self-interested action, or even calling it self-interest rightly understood. And she did so, she said, for the very reason that it made people afraid, because she wanted to take the connotation and the denotation of the word. Literally speaking, self-interested means selfish. It means a regard for one's own benefit. That's not the same as selfish in the way that the common usage is, but from the perspective of, are you talking about a moral sense, about ethical egoism, which is sometimes contrasted with egotism, right? An excessive view of oneself, an excessive, almost megalomaniac view of one's own self-worth, versus egoism, which means a perspective that you are the proper beneficiary of your moral action, that you are acting for yourself, not in a way that's detrimental to others and not in a way that's sacrificial to others. Again, a lot of this has to do with how language maybe has evolved. over time. So often when one says, I'm acting in my self-interest, it might be distinguished, especially in American English, although I suspect in British and other English-speaking countries, it might be distinguished from what one considers to be selfish. And that's a choice that Rand made. She was, if nothing else, a radical and provocative writer, and I think chose that specifically to get people's attention, to challenge and to shake up the debate a little bit. Let's see. Is being a social creature something that is predetermined or something that is learned as you grow up in a social environment? For example, if a person grew up in an environment with little to no social setting, will that lead to some kind of mental deficiency? Wow. This is interesting. Human beings, and this is, let me answer this from the perspective slightly wider than simply what Ayn Rand wrote, but more, this is my own perspective. So I'm speaking for myself now, but I'm basing this upon a lot of other thinkers that I've considered. There is an incredible gift that human beings have as creatures. And to contemplate this, one merely needs to contemplate what can happen with the potentiality of human nature. Human nature at birth is incredibly plastic. It's incredibly flexible, adaptable. And that trait is a survival value. It is in that sense, as the questioner asks, it is something that is in a sense predetermined or pre-programmed. That flexibility, the development of one's mind, even the development of one's physical brain, has not fully completed at the time of birth. Human beings as a species are among the most helpless and fragile creatures at birth. And there are a lot of evolutionary and biological reasons for this, but suffice it to say that what is possible to a human being at birth is incredible. The great educator and educational philosopher Maria Montessori noted that a child at birth has the potential to grow up in any culture. It's really an amazing thing. If you imagine, for example, that rather than one hospital where children are switched at birth, that somehow magically, like in a movie almost, one could swap children at birth from radically diverse countries and cultures and even language traditions. And you take an infant that's born to newborn parents, the newborn to parents, say born in mainland China, and you swap that individual child with a child that is born in Nigeria. Now, that child, when you swap them, the child who grows up in Nigeria and the child who grows up in China will grow up speaking the local language, adopting the local customs, and in some ways having the local mores, the ways of thinking, the ways of relating to one another, even though genetically that individual is not like the parents who raised it, because the individual human is incredibly plastic. One of the amazing things, again, that Montessori and other child development psychologists have noted, one of the other interesting and fascinating things about a human being is that so much of what we learn and so much of how we can conduct our lives is absorbed almost as if through the air in the first 3 years of life. So a child in the first 3 years of life learns to begin speaking its own language, the language that it hears adults speaking around it. No one can replicate that, right? The ease with which a child, simply exposed by hearing to a language, can learn a language. As adults, it's effortful. We have to think about it. We have to listen. We have to practice. Anyone as an adult or even as a teenager who's tried to learn a second language, you find that it's a lot of work. Infants do that automatically. They have brains that are receptive to language, and they do so without accents, without by learning a complex grammar. They do so automatically. And what's fascinating about that is that all kinds of things, movement, fine motor control, gross motor control, balance, proprioception, all of the aspects of the human physical being are just happening. The brain is making millions, if not billions of trillions of connections. And there's this incredible process that's going on in the early life of a child. And all of that is, as I said, happening, as Montessori called it, it's an absorptive mind. The absorption is just happening and they're taking in. If one had to explain to an adult, how do you pinch your fingers together? It would take an extraordinary amount of effort and language to discuss and to walk through. And to anyone who's ever lost movement in a limb or who's lost the ability to speak, regaining that and reteaching that and explaining it in adult terms is incredibly complex. But a child, if you've ever been around small children, can watch and do simply through observation. Now, to get back to the question, if an individual, if a child, for some reason, had grown up largely outside of a social setting, enormous amounts of that learning of what is the human sum of knowledge would be lost to that child. Indeed, developmental psychologists since the 19th century have discussed the phenomenon of what they call feral children, children who have been lost to their parents, either out in the woods or in very tragic cases, children who have been locked up by incredibly vicious parents who are not caring and who don't have that interest of their child. And what they've discovered is that at certain ages, there are certain windows that close. If one is never exposed to language by age 6, it's very, very difficult to acquire much more than what a 3 to 5, 6-year-old child ever has. There's a certain plasticity that closes off. Neuroscientists have an idea that there are things that shut down in the brain. Likewise, those social interactions, the feeling of touch and of closeness to other human beings, the kind of social benefit that we get just from others' presence, from knowing each other is there, being absent could very well be to the detriment of an individual. So ultimately, to answer that question, all of those social interactions of social mores, things that are inherently social, like language. Language is what language you speak and how you speak it and the words you choose, definitely arbitrary. They change over time, they evolve. The language of 16th century England is not the same as the language of 10th century England. And it's definitely not the English we speak today. All you have to do is pick up Shakespeare or Chaucer or any Beowulf or whatever, and you know that it's not the same. It evolves. It's definitely arbitrary in the sense that we pick and choose and we can change it by kind of collective assent. But a lot of those things missing during that key moment of development would in fact lead to mental and possibly even physical deficiencies, the inability to move, to exercise one's muscles, to learn how to move in space and carry oneself and be balanced. And in those rare, very, very tragic cases that are in the medical literature and the psychological literature, it is an incredibly and profoundly sad thing because in a sense, it's a denial of that individual's humanity. They're still a human being in the sense of they are a human animal, but at the same time, there's something missing. Okay, so let's move on. I could say a lot about that. Human development is a very interesting topic. Okay, so Atlas Shrugged was eye-opening for me, but Rand has been criticized for overstepping the boundaries of self-interest in a way that could be seen as cruel, and also in a way that ignores marginalized or oppressed peoples. How have scholars examined self-interest while considering racism, sexism, and other systems of oppression? Great question. Interestingly, in that same book, in Atlas Shrugged, in The Virtue of Selfishness, Rand has an essay on racism. I think it was originally written in 1962 or 63, where she's very clear that racism is profoundly anti-individualistic, that the core of racism is the idea of collectivism, the idea that one can form a judgment, whether positive or negative, often in the case of racism, a negative judgment, about an individual based upon a evaluation that one makes of a group, that one treats an individual as if that individual did not have all of the attributes of an individual, that individual was merely lumped into a group. And often, as she points out in that essay, in a way that is detrimental, even if one were evaluating that group, that one is doing so on a premise that is antithetical to a proper evaluation. But in terms of other systems of oppression, interestingly, one of the things that's often not noted about Ayn Rand is that she was one of the earliest writers to speak out about issues like the Vietnam War, which she thought was an incredible mistake. She spoke out against the draft. She spoke out against all kinds of things in the 1960s when she was alive that she saw that were detrimental to human society. I think in terms of how one analyzes the concept of self-interest relative to those controversies, to those conflicts, one has to ask, what kind of society would be the best society to live in? Would it be a society in which individuals were not using their rational minds and not thinking in independent ways about issues of individuality, issues of moral judgment of others, issues of trade with others? Or would it be better for those individuals to be rational? I think the answer is always a society in which individuals engage in the irrationality of racism are detrimental not only to the interests of those who are holding those views, or who are even worse, acting on those views. They're detrimental even to the other members of that society, whether those members are members of the so-called majority or minority, or any other group within that society. Just because one happens to be in the say in group doesn't mean that it's good for you. It's similar to those examples in economics, that having a principle of irrationality as part of the society, whether it's institutional or just individual action, is detrimental to the individual, whether or not they're being oppressed personally. The idea of oppression is personally detrimental to me, because not only psychologically do I have to see that, I have to deal with those individuals, and I also have to recognize the unrealized gains that I might have were those individuals free and able to prosper in the way that would be beneficial to everyone in society. So I would recommend, if you've read Atlas Shrugged, that's great that it was eye-opening for you. I'd recommend, if you're interested in some of these topics, that you look at some of Rand's other works. Like I said, The Virtue of Selfishness is where you can find her essay entitled Racism, where she analyzes that issue from her perspective. Some of her other nonfiction works, she deals with some of those other questions. Let's see, next question from Mia. What books, reading material would I recommend to delve more into self-interest and how it evolved over time? Great question. I would say the two best works, the ones that I consulted most heavily in preparing for tonight's presentation. Number one would be by Albert Hirschman. It's Hirshman, Albert Hirschman. And the book that he wrote that deals with this is called The Passions and the Interests. It's a thin little volume. It's pretty heavy intellectual history, so it may talk about a lot of writers that you're not familiar with, but it's written for a wide audience, not necessarily an academic audience, and it just goes through some of those early thinkers who touched on the idea of interest as it developed before Adam Smith. Another great book, I mean, I would recommend Rand's works herself, but on developing over time, another work that's an interesting one I happen to have on my desk here, I was consulting it just before tonight's presentation. It's a book by Jerry Muller, and it's called The Mind and the Market. It's M-U-L-L-E-R, Jerry Muller. And it's a broader view of thinkers in the Western tradition, both in favor of and opposed to capitalism. And so it often touches on these questions of self-interest. It's not exclusively about that, but I think it has great vignettes in each of the thinkers. It deals with, Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, Karl Marx, lots and lots of different views of capitalism, both pro and, con. Voltaire, Hegel, Matthew Arnold, Schumpeter, Keynes, Marcuse, Friedrich Hayek, Lukács, Fryer, a bunch of thinkers. So that's another great one that I would recommend. So let's see, next question. Going off of what I said, would self-interest be a reason that politicians bring in religion? Possibly. Politicians, as the public choice theorists would say, attempt to maximize their self-interest, and their self-interest politically often means, appealing to voters, appealing to continuing in office, and for some politicians, religion would be a favorable value to do so. Others, they may not. I don't know that self-interest per se, in that narrower sense, rather than say their enlightened self-interest, would be a reason that they bring it up. But it's entirely possible that if that's something, and as one may note throughout American history, certainly American history, although undoubtedly in other political regimes as well, the kinds of things that politicians bring up or represent as being a part of their identity aren't always authentically who they are, but they may be perceived as something that is beneficial to their goals, right? This would be what social scientists call their instrumentally rational, right? It's a means ends. How do I get what I want? Well, I want to be reelected. I get that by presenting a particular view of myself, whether or not that's true. Now, I would say, and Rand would say, that's profoundly not in your interest. Not only is it a possibility that you might be found out, but you also have to deal with that mental burden and cognitive load of knowing that you have deceived someone. Once you've deceived the public in that way, you're constantly having to engage in mental gymnastics not to let that secret out. And so you have to engage in a whole process of deception with oneself. You have to detach oneself from reality to maintain such a fiction. And so as a result of that, it's not truly in your interest. But as I said, there may be some who authentically are religious, and they find that that is a way that they can achieve their goals, i.e. re-election or making deals with other politicians, and that might be. So it's hard to say. Some politicians might, some politicians might not. Next question. What if self-interest hurts my relationships or the people around me? If I were to cut someone out of my life for the interest of my mental health, that would hurt the other person. Is it possible to coexist with others instead of contrasting interests? Wow. That is a deep and challenging question for many, many people. There are a lot of ways that when other individuals that you relate with, that you may be related to, are not pursuing rationality. They might be acting in ways that are irrational. They might be acting in ways, as the questioner notes, are detrimental to your mental health. They're a drag on your sanity. They're a drag on your time. They cause you anxiety. They cause you stress. And the best path for you may be to, as the questioner says, cut them out of your life, which undoubtedly would cause them some pain. It's never a pleasant thing. And there are times when that's the way that one can achieve better mental health, a better financial relationship, a better, lots of things in one's interest. One's interest and pursuing one's rational self-interest does not guarantee that one's actions may not cause pain. That's a fact of the choices that the other individual may have made. That other individual, if they are acting irrationally, and that's what's causing you the distress or the challenge to your sanity, to your mental health, that individual ultimately is reaping what he or she has sown by departing from rationality, and that hurts, right? Just in the same way that pursuing a habit of smoking tobacco cigarettes for 80 years can hurt. It can cause lung cancer. It can cause emphysema. It can be a detriment to your physical health. It can be antithetical to your flourishing. You may get to the age where you can't enjoy being with your grandchildren because you've damaged yourself physically so much. Likewise, pursuing detrimental mental or psychological or intellectual traits can hurt. It hurts in different ways. It hurts emotionally. But the idea that self-interest and that individuals pursuing their self-interest is consonant with others doesn't always guarantee that there aren't contrasting interests. Those interests, though, may be ones that are not in line with a rational set of values, and in which case that will hurt. But that's a really good question. It's a tough thing sometimes to make a determination that what is truly in one's own best self-interest and rational values is to dissociate from another human being, to not have anything to do with them. It's not an easy choice, and it's often one that causes us mental distress as well as that of the person that we have to cut out of our lives. Are there any texts not by anyone that I've mentioned so far that I would recommend about what I discussed? I mean, the two that I mentioned to the previous questioner, the book by Hirschman, although I did mention that tonight, but also the book by Muller. And then last, although I'll preface this recommendation by saying that it's the most academic of all the books that I've recommended. The last one is Pierre Force, F-O-R-C-E. And the title of that one is simply Self-Interest Before Adam Smith. It's a very deep dive into the idea of self-interest prior to Adam Smith. I'd recommend reading Adam Smith, right? I mean, it's always going back to the original is a good thing. You know, that's another thing we can consider. Caitlin asks, how do you align your self-interest and career choice? That's a really good question. That's a really good question. I would say, because a career is a career is a value, right? Everyone needs to have a productive life. Everyone needs to provide for themselves, their physical and you know, both their spiritual and moral and all their other needs. How one does that, what kind of career, what job in particular, is a question about which there's enormous variation. My recommendation, and this is some of the best advice that I had when I was in college. A professor of mine gave me this advice, and I like to pass it along because I think it helped me at a time when I was very uncertain about what I wanted to do with my life. He told me that one of the best ways of thinking about a career choice is to think about the things that one loves to do. Don't think about it in the sense of, maybe I'll be a doctor, and then kind of get an image of a doctor, the doctors that you've interacted with or that you've seen on television, or maybe I'll be a lawyer, or maybe I'll be a sports agent, or maybe I'll be a teacher. And then what happens when you think that way is that you get particular, very specific images into your head about those careers, those professions, and they may not always be accurate. What you can do is spend some time introspecting, thinking about your own talents and desires, and think about the kinds of things that you love to do. What is going to get you out of bed and have your feet hit the floor, and you're just going to attack the day knowing that you get to do blank, right? That you get to write, or you get to go be outdoors, or you get to, the types of things that really animate your passions. And then start to investigate, what are the types of careers that match up with doing those things frequently? What are the types of things that I can do that are productive endeavors? Now, one of the questions that I often get about career choice in that sense is, what if my career choice isn't something that I can make a living at, right? What if I want to be an artist, but nobody recognizes my greatness? Well, often that's where your self-interest might say, pursuing art or pursuing something like that as a passion, perhaps to the point where you one day are able to make a living at it, is something where you might need a job for a while, right? Not a career, but a job to pay the bills, or a way to ensure that you're materially set up so that you have the time and the effort to pursue that long-term career goal. And lots of people do this in their lives. And it's not just art. It could be law. It could be teaching. It could be any number of things that one wants to do that don't necessarily pay the bills right now, or that aren't accessible to you right now. But a career is a kind of identification of the work that one loves to do. And so finding that alignment between one's self-interest and one's career is ultimately a sense of, what can I do that I love that also aligns with me being able to live the kind of life that I want? And sometimes there are choices that need to be made. If you really want to be able to live a particular lifestyle, that may foreshorten the types of careers you can choose. But you can adapt and change those. There's a lot out there. And one of the most amazing things in a free society is the number of different ways that you can carve out new careers that no one's ever thought of as a way of aligning your self-interest. So it looks like we have just a couple minutes. I'm going to scroll through and see if I can find another really good one. Please don't think that if I don't answer your question, it's not a good one. We're just running pretty close on time. Let's see. And for those of you who are planning on coming next week, some of these questions will be really great ones to ask Craig as well. Let's see, one last question. Okay, let me take this one. I think this is a good one. Do you think that embracing the right kind of self-interest as a society could help reduce poverty and the people with financial social disadvantages? Right now, most people who reject self-interest argue that self-interest is most detrimental to that class of people, and that being self-interested hurts people in poverty and is extremely selfish. Good question. I do think that embracing a system of the right kind of self-interest based upon rational values, where individuals are responsible for their own lives and responsible for their own productivity, would be a way of reducing poverty in the world. One of the amazing things about what Smith called the commercial society, or what modern people call capitalism, the free market, what have you, is that over the course of history, before this concept of a self-interested society, of unleashing people's pursuits of material gain, was really enacted into society, was given time to flourish, there was, for millennia, universal, almost beyond poverty. Individuals throughout history lived on incredibly, incredibly low amounts of material wealth. The unleashing of modern society in the 18th century of political freedom, combined with the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th century, which was a consequence of some of that political freedom, and the reorientation of human rationality to the problem of survival, created a society that grew in leaps and bounds, and has in many ways begun and has in some parts of the world eliminated the kind of poverty and social disadvantage that was seen as a natural consequence of human life only 300 years ago or 400 years ago. The modern system of self-interested pursuit, rational self-interested pursuit of values, and the exchange and the gains from trade that are possible in a free society, has led to unheard of productivity. I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but I have a basic ballpark. In the time that humanity on this planet has gone from 1 billion to 2 billion people, the rate of poverty went from something like 80% of the world to 60% of the world. In the time that humanity has gone from 2 billion people to 7 billion people, the number of people living below poverty wages in the world has dropped to below, I think it's around 10%, maybe below 10%. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's living in the same style and fashion as Americans or other people in Western countries. But the conquest of poverty, the conquest of social and financial and economic dislocation has been completely transformed by the spread of free, open societies that allow the pursuit of self-interest. And it's an amazing, amazing process. I know that both Craig and Anne in the next 2 weeks in this series will be talking more about that, particularly Anne about entrepreneurship and what the power of that is. But I definitely think the only way to overcome that kind of poverty is to recognize the rights of people, to give them the power to pursue their self-interest so that they can solve those questions, those material questions of how do we provide for 7, 8, 10 billion humans on this planet. Okay, so we're out of time. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight and for all of your great questions, many of which, unfortunately, I was unable to get to, but it has been a pleasure speaking with you tonight. And I encourage you all to continue on in the series and come to parts 2 and 3.